welcome members. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Lib Dem Friends of Palestine Fringe event. If you can mute if you're not speaking, that would be really helpful. And I'm really delighted to welcome our guest today, Danielle Bett from Yakad, who will be interviewed by Ruvi Ziegler, who many of you may already know through his work with the Lib Dems, including Lib Dem Seekers of Sanctuary, and who we are very fortunate to also have as our executive member of Liberal Democrat Friends of Palestine. You may have listened to one or two of his excellent speeches at conferences, past and present, including one this morning in the Ukraine debate. I believe that he'll be leaving us a little early as he is in demand as a valued speaker at conference. I am Anne-Marie Simpson and I will be chairing the meeting. The idea is to open up to questions after the interview, which will last around 35 minutes. I really encourage you to ask questions, and Danielle has said she doesn't mind a challenge, so please use the Q&A to flag that you have any questions and I'll call on you to ask them. Please do keep mics muted if not speaking, as interference can be bad otherwise. Thank you. I shall tell you a bit about both Danielle and Ruvi and then hand over to Ruvi. Danielle Bett is Director of Communications for Yakad. Yakad, as many of you will know, is a Jewish organisation based in the UK working for a political resolution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Prior to joining Yakad in 2021, Danielle worked as the Jewish Leadership Council Scotland manager. She has worked on a number of interfaith and anti-racism initiatives. She has also worked closely with the Israeli community in Scotland, having founded the Scottish Israeli Cultural Association, a non-political, non-religious initiative for Israelis living in Scotland. She has a degree in international relations and Spanish from the University of St Andrews. Danielle is a Scottish Israeli, having grown up in Israel, and she speaks English, Hebrew, and Spanish. I'll move on to Ruvi now. Dr. Ruvi Ziegler, Ruvi, is Associate Professor in International Refugee Law at the University of Reading School of Law, where he is the Director of Postgraduate Talk Programmes and Co-Chair of the LGBT+ Staff Network. Ruvi's areas of research interest include international refugee law, electoral rights and citizenship, comparative constitutional law, and international humanitarian law. Ruvi is an Associate Academic Fellow of the Honourable Society of the Inner Temple, Research Associate of the Refugee Studies Centre, University of Oxford, Editor of the Reporter and co-convener of the Migration and Asylum section of the Society of Legal Scholars, Senior Research Associate of the Refugee Law Initiative and Editor-in-Chief of its working paper series. He is a visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg and at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Ruvi's public engagements include serving as Chair of the Board of Trustees of New Europeans Association UK, Chair of Oxford European Association, a Britain in Europe academic expert, and an advisory council member of the Jewish human rights organisation, Renekasa. Previously, Ruvi was a visiting researcher at Harvard Law School's Immigration and Refugee Clinic and with the Human Rights Programme, and a tutor in public relations law at Oxford. Ruvi is the author of Voting Rights of Refugees. And after all that, I will now hand over to Ruvi and to Danielle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie, and for this very generous interaction, and welcome, Danielle, to the Lib Dems and to this session in particular. I'm really delighted to be doing the interview, and I do want to extend in advance my apologies. I wasn't supposed to be double booked at the same time slot, but the other fringe I'm supposed to be speaking at on Seekers of Sanctuary, very relevantly for today, was moved forward because of the visit by the Ukrainian party leader in the next time slot. And so after the interview with Danielle, I'll hand over back to Anne-Marie. And so apologies in advance, I won't be able to see and as you were, field your questions, which I'm sure will be intriguing, but I'll be sure to watch the second half of the session once we've kind of concluded it. So without further ado, let me just say, well, what Danielle and I have agreed would be a good idea in terms of our structure. And ultimately, the two issues of the day, one that is a general global issue, but that has specific and I think quite interesting dimensions in relation to Israel, to Palestinians, and indeed to the Jewish community in the UK, is the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So we'll be talking about that first, and then after that, we'll talk about what we thought, when we conceived of this session a few weeks ago, little did we know, would be the big issue from our perspective, which is the Amnesty International report on practice of apartheid. And so with regard to each of these topics, well, I'll be asking Danielle to reflect and also offer some of my reflections on both the reactions and the way these topics are approached in Israel itself and by the Israeli government and Israeli society. Two are not always the same, and compare and contrast it with the way reactions have mounted in the British Jewish community, and try to understand. I think part of the purpose of this session is to understand the differences, divergences between that, because they are clear, both on Ukraine and arguably even more so in reactions to the Amnesty International report. So let's start with Ukraine, and I know, Danielle, maybe you want to give us your first insight as to what is the how you'd characterize as the Israeli government's response to what we see in Ukraine.
Thank you. So I think the Israeli government response has been quite interesting, because the expectation was that due to pressure from Russia, keeping in mind the Russian presence on the Syrian border with Israel, Israel wouldn't react and wouldn't align with the international community. It actually has. We've seen that Israel has voted with the international community in the UN. We've seen that there have been condemnations both from the Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid and from Naftali Bennett, although they have been quite careful in the character of their response to criticize but not be as critical of Russia. Having said that, they have been part of the kind of diplomatic attempts, and also there's been quite a strong response in terms of wanting to accept refugees, with the caveat that specifically bringing in Jewish refugees more than the rest of the Ukrainian population. And that in itself has been a debate. So I think it's been quite interesting, both in terms of the Israeli willingness to condemn Russia. I would argue that wouldn't be the case had we still been under Bibi Netanyahu's leadership. But obviously it's been quite careful and measured and taken into account very much the Syrian issue as well. And I think overall, if you look at Israeli society has been very, very much on the side of Ukraine. There have been several polls that show that Israelis support Ukraine, though we can get a little bit more into how that breaks down as well. There have been multiple protests across Israel in favor of Ukrainians. There's a big Ukrainian Jewish community in Israel already. So I think overall the response has been really positive. And whilst there is some irony in the fact that they don't recognize the Palestinian refugee issue, I think it does say something about the general Israeli social character, which is pro-refugee, it is pro-human rights when it is well educated on those issues and when it is exposed to those issues.
Brilliant, thanks, Danielle. Yeah, I think that's really encapsulates quite a few of the issues quite well, and I want to drill into. I've been muted. I'll unmute myself again ruthlessly. Perhaps muted again. Of interest to this audience really relates to that point you made in passing about the kind of elephant in the room in relation to Palestinians, and to some extent that's kind of reflected in Israel voting in a General Assembly, because quite interestingly, as you said, Israel voted along 140 other countries, and actually with abstentions, 35 abstentions, mostly coming from Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Central Asian countries, so countries that used to be part of the non-aligned movement. So Israel, in many ways, voted with the vast majority of the world for a resolution which, and this is the lawyer in me saying, actually, amongst other things, affirms the principle that the territory of a state shall not be the object of acquisition by another state resulting from the threat or use of force. And that dates back to 1970, and at the time was actually a resolution that was partly passed as you were in non-recognition of acquisition of territory in the 67 or 6-Day War. And I wonder if you want to share with us a bit of your reflections on the ways in which Israeli society sees this conflict in Ukraine in comparison with its conflicts with its neighbors and with the Palestinians. Is there a clear analogy to be drawn between Israel and one of those sides of the conflict, or is it, and perhaps that would be my view, but I'll be interested in yours, it really is more complex and more nuanced than that?
So I'll start with the caveat that I'm speaking as an Israeli and not as a Palestinian, because I think the Palestinian perspective on this will be very, very different. So the main difference being that Palestinians see occupation every single day and Israelis do not. And I think that really is the key response of Israelis, is that they have seen in breaking news the active invasion of Ukraine. They have seen people fleeing war. They've seen buildings being ruined. They've seen the entire thing play out and have a very natural sympathy for the Ukrainian people who've become refugees. And a lot of people have made comparisons, as in Israelis, and I wouldn't obviously compare to the Holocaust, but a lot of Jews have drawn these comparisons of these are images that are familiar to us. And so there is a natural sympathy to that. They don't see the real life of Palestinians on a day-to-day basis. Israelis aren't exposed in the news, or very rarely in the news are they exposed to hardships in Gaza. Very rarely are they exposed to, the results of occupation in the West Bank. So it's easy for them to have sympathy for something that's so very much in front of their faces, that their leaders are all talking about, that they're being made aware of. And I think that's why the response is so strong. There's like a lot of fundraising going on. There's a lot of people who are, also kind of trying to donate as much as possible the goods that are necessary for Ukrainian refugees, including those who are not arriving in Israel. There really is a collective social effort, and I think that reflects well on Israeli society. And I do think that the reason that the hypocrisy exists is partially because people find it difficult to self-reflect on their own actions, but also because they simply don't see Palestinians in that way. And also, I do think we need to remember that the narrative that's existed in Israel for a very long time is that Palestinians are the enemy. So it's more difficult to become sympathetic for people who have been framed to you as your enemy and as people who sit as a risk to your day-to-day life. The wall is there and the checkpoints are there and the fence is there because those people are an enemy. And so that narrative is something that is very difficult to deconstruct, especially when wars have happened, the Intifada has happened, etc. Whereas Ukrainians are not presented as an enemy in any way, shape, or form. And on the contrary, because so many people do know Ukrainian Jews, it's really easy to sympathize with them as people who deserve help and refuge.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think the other interesting dimension that I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on, and you touched on this in terms of where Israel positioned itself in relation to this conflict, partly being affected by what happens in Syria, which in effect is a border with a Russian-influenced state, for want of better words. I mean, one of the 5 countries that voted on the Russian side, alongside Belarus, Eritrea, and North Korea, was Syria, in fact. So that perhaps isn't a surprising figure. And we all know Israel's been conducting occasional mini military operations in Syria with the acquiescence of the Russians. So that probably plays some role, right, in the tiptoeing, but I wonder how kind of this is seen in the wider sense of again an alignment along Cold War kind of type divisions, where Israel is kind of aligning itself with the West, because I think when we talked about this before, you were mentioning that there's some polling, although one poll I think that suggests that Palestinian citizens of Israel are perhaps less likely to support the Ukrainian side. So I wonder if you have any reflection on that phenomenon.
Yeah, so the polling is, I've put a huge question mark on it because it is one specific poll, but it did have some interesting findings. So the overall polling in Israel shows that the vast majority of Israelis do support Ukrainians, and if they were to be asked to choose a side in the conflict, the side that they choose is Ukraine. Where those numbers do shift slightly is there is a difference between left-wing and right-wing voters and centrist voters as well. So centrist and left-wing voters are largely the same in terms of their support. Right-wing voters are slightly less likely to support Ukraine. I think that's probably quite accurate, and I don't think that's to do with the human rights angle, but more power dynamics and people who believe that the relationship with Russia is more important than human rights. And that's kind of the narrative I've seen reflected by right-wing politicians in Israel, right-wing commentators. They're not really that interested in the human rights debate. I am painting everyone with a broad brush. It's not true for everyone, but it's more around the power dynamic with Russia. And as you pointed out, any military operations that Israel does in Syria have to have a Russian blessing. And if they lose that relationship with Russia, it makes it really difficult to manage the border with Syria. And that's kind of the biggest challenge. The one poll that did show that Palestinian citizens of Israel are less likely than Jewish Israelis to support Ukraine. I mean, again, I will question mark it in terms of I don't know how many non-Jews were surveyed. I don't know enough about the numbers, so I am a little bit skeptical. But I also think there's a general feeling of frustration that I've seen with a lot of Palestinians not understanding why it is that there's so much support for Ukrainians and so much support for bringing in Ukrainian refugees, where Palestinians are losing their homes and not gaining rights. And I think that frustration exists rather than, again, I don't think it's because Palestinians are less likely to be sympathetic towards Ukraine. I think it's more of a frustration with Israeli society and politicians, indeed, in their response.
Yeah, I think that sounds right, and I kind of bringing in anecdotally from work I've done on asylum seekers in Israel, because of course you were saying that Israel is now debating. It's very much welcoming in open arms Jewish refugees from Ukraine, but it's far less unequivocal about accepting non-Jewish refugees from Ukraine. But to some extent, also the treatment even of those is much better than the treatment of African asylum seekers who've been coming to Israel in the last 15 years. And one of the things that I at the time found quite surprising was that leaders of Arab Israeli parties in the Israeli parliament haven't been at the forefront of fighting, say, for rights of asylum seekers from Africa. And part of the explanation I got when I queried this with members of parliament was precisely the point that you make. It's kind of a point that it's all good and well to fight for rights of others, but actually we are still suffering immense discrimination, which is often being sidestepped by these other conflicts, and would of course come back in a couple of minutes to precisely that through the Amnesty International report. But before we do that, I just wanted to get a sense from you as how you see the Jewish reaction in Britain to the Ukrainian conflict. Would you characterize it as effectively uniform and consensus-like, or is there a divergence here as well?
Can I just add quickly on the Israeli issue as well? Just this week, the Israeli government has passed a law, the citizenship law, renewed the law, which prevents Palestinians from the right, specifically exempting Palestinians from the right of citizenship through marriage. So it's a law that specifically discriminates against Palestinians. So through marriage, to become an Israeli, it's already quite difficult for non-Jews, but there is a law that makes it far more difficult, if not impossible, for Palestinians. So in the same week that Israel has passed a law that specifically discriminates against Palestinians, it also is talking about bringing in refugees from Ukraine and helping Ukrainian refugees. So I think that narrative also needs to be kept in mind with the Palestinian dynamic. In terms of Jewish diaspora, from a British point of view, I think for the most part, except for very fringe elements who I don't think are really worth drawing attention to, the vast majority of the British community does support Ukrainians. I think on the whole, there is a community that, again, supports human rights. I think there is a blind spot slightly for the Palestinian issue, but yeah, I think people believe that it's the right thing to do. I think when they see a clear aggressor and they see a clear victim, they feel the desire to support that victim. You know, and that includes even sanctions, which is really interesting because obviously the vast majority of the British community will oppose sanctions in almost any form, or if not in any form, against the Israeli government, but it will support on the whole sanctions against Russia and understand the need for sanctions against Russia. So I think that is obviously, again, an area of discomfort, but for the most part, the British Jewish community is supportive of Ukrainian refugees, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, that's been my impression as well. And anecdotally, I think one of the interesting things in the Jewish Board of Deputies kind of statement around Ukraine from a few days ago was a specific condemnation of what they characterized as the trivialization and distortion of historical facts of the Holocaust by Vladimir Putin. Because of course, one of the things the Russian state has tried to do was to say what they're doing is a form of denazification of Ukraine from what are pro-Nazi or pro-fascist forces, which is particularly ironic given Ukraine as a Jewish president was grandfather who's a Holocaust survivor. But it's I think you're absolutely right. I think on that there seems to be unanimity, not so much, and this is kind of a segue into our next discussion when it came to the publication of the Amnesty International report just over a month ago, and on that, I think when we discussed this previously, I think your initial kind of reflection was that actually, as you were, the Jewish community in Britain took that report much more to heart and was in a way much more startled by it and reacted strongly to it than perhaps Israel and Israeli political parties have. So perhaps we can reverse kind of the angle and actually start here with how the British community, the British Jewish community, has been responding to the Amnesty International report and how you explain that response.
Sorry, I know it's 2022 and I should be used to the mute button. So yeah, I mean, the British Jewish community response to the Amnesty report was exactly what you would expect it to be, which is that they condemned it and they didn't accept it. They responded very similarly to the Human Rights Watch report last year. I think, I mean, it's not unexpected. I think they take kind of clear offense to Israel being called an apartheid state. There is kind of a difference between those who then call that anti-Semitism and those who don't. I think the official response from the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council didn't use the word anti-Semitism, but the subsequent articles, statements, and comments from various Jewish leaders in the UK did term it anti-Semitism or say that it came from a place of anti-Jewish hate in some way, shape, or form, which is a little bit different, but it's still the same point. I think that the issue is, and like you say, that the like a lot of Israelis will be less aware of the Amnesty report than British Jews, in my opinion, because they're not as active. They don't feel like the international community doesn't affect their day-to-day lives. Whereas for British Jews, who are a minority in the UK, this kind of dialogue about Israel does affect their day-to-day lives, and that's what it feels like for them. I don't expect the Jewish community to endorse these, but I do think we have to have a very serious conversation about ultimately very major human rights organizations are using the term apartheid. Israeli human rights organization like B'Tselem and others have used this term. And the thing that is most frustrating for organizations like us, we kind of say, you know, it's not about endorsing it, it's about engaging in this dialogue. And the most frustrating part of the mainstream British communal response is around completely dismissing it, but also mischaracterizing it and not engaging with the actual issue, which is Palestinians. The response is kind of often what you expect, which is there are Arab judges in Israel, there are Arab members of Knesset. How could it possibly be an apartheid state? And that's not really engaging with the reality of Palestinians. And it's not engaging with the reality of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And it's kind of an insincere response. I think you can have a debate on the term apartheid and you don't have to endorse it. But engage in the actual reality of the situation and engage in the actual issues that are being presented. I think the other thing is that kind of there's a gut instinct, and I used to have this too, so I really understand it, is to defend Israel and say, you know, Israel's a democracy and it's not what you think it is. And it's true. It's not South African apartheid, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something completely different. And again, we need to engage with that reality. And honestly, we need to listen to Palestinian voices, and we need to get better at listening to Palestinian voices. I think the best example is if you go with pro-Israel, I don't like that term, but pro-Israel organizations tour, and you go to Hebron. They take you up to a certain point in Hebron where you see like Jews praying, and then you see a few Palestinians that you can speak to, and it's like, of course there's no segregation here because you can speak to both people and clearly they're in the same space. But they don't take you 5 minutes further into a city that's been absolutely destroyed by segregation. And I think that's also part of the point, is people, and a lot of Jews in the diaspora, are not aware of the extent of segregation, of the extent of discrimination against Palestinians, and their day-to-day lived reality.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo all what you say. I think there are two interesting points here. I mean, the first is, and I think it is a discussion in a way. It's for each organization and institution to devise their best strategy, right? But there was, in a way, there was an inevitability that even though Amnesty International actually explicitly, and we indeed put it in our report on it, say they make absolutely clear that although the practices they describe in the report fall within the legal definition of apartheid, they are not drawing parallels with what was perpetrated in South Africa. So precisely your point, in a way, a response to this report that says, oh, hold on, but I mean, how can you compare it? We don't have separate benches for Jews and non-Jews. That is entirely beside the point, right? It's a straw person response, because that isn't what the report is saying. It's describing a series of domination and oppression. It's describing a regime of law and policies and practices that has institutionalized modalities that fall within the category of apartheid. But that does raise a question, and I do kind of want to press you in a way on whether Yachad thinks it was helpful or it is helpful to be using this label, because actually the executive director of Amnesty International in Israel itself, Molly Malekar, said that she thought that it was not helpful to use the term, precisely because, in a way, directed attention from the content of the report to the discussion around the term. And she said their branch was actually split on this. And I wonder what, because Yachad, I think, hasn't used it before, and I'm not sure still uses it, but I wonder what Yachad thinks, as you were, about the usefulness of that terminology.
To be honest, I haven't drawn like a comfortable one-line conclusion on this. So Yachad still won't use the term to label Israel as an apartheid state. What we will do is we will engage with those who do. Firstly, the human rights community, and I think ultimately, when human rights organizations who are on the field and speaking to Palestinians and investigating the legal systems in place are using certain terminology, it's not for us to then entirely dismiss them over one word and not engage with the reality. And the reality is occupation. And if apartheid is a term that makes you uncomfortable, so be it. But you still need to engage with the fact that there is an occupation that is getting worse. The status quo is not a stable situation. It's a situation that's getting worse. Settlements are expanding. It's becoming more and more difficult for Palestinian state to be a reality. And I think we need to engage with that reality, because if occupation is supposed to be a short-term solution and it becomes a long-term reality that doesn't change, then what do you call that? Because it is two legal systems applied to two different people. So we try and engage with that, with the warning of what occupation that never ends is going to become. And I also think we need to stop cringing when the word apartheid is used. And especially what I say is, if a Palestinian decides to define their oppression in that way, it is absolutely not for me to tell them it's something else. And if I feel uncomfortable with how a Palestinian terms the oppression that they're expressing, I should feel far more comfortable with the reality that they're experiencing every day. So I'm not sure. I know that's a really convoluted way of answering your question, but hopefully it kind of does.
No, I mean, I think it does, but I think it also, as I say, I think there's a principled question of whether a policy of fits a legal definition, and there's a tactical question of what is the best modality to get response. I mean, some people from Amnesty, and I've actually spoken to a couple of people, have said, actually they think that the use of the term gave much more publicity to the report, much more attention to the report, and actually drew attention that perhaps otherwise wouldn't have been there, which is also important from their perspective, human rights organization. But I wonder what to kind of then come back to the Israeli official response. How do you see the response to this report, perhaps in a wider context of engagement with international institutions, with the human rights community? Of course, we know the previous government has been pretty awful on trying to investigate funding for human rights organizations and also characterizing them in very derogatory terms. And we haven't seen that much of that rhetoric, I think, prior to the Amnesty report. But do you think the Amnesty report has changed this in any way?
No. So I think I do agree that the term is being used in an attempt to raise more awareness and to garner attention. I think the unfortunate thing is I'm not sure that's working, and if people don't care about the occupation, I'm not sure they're going to care if it's being labeled as something else. And that's kind of the sad truth, not just Israelis, but wider. I think it's kind of a debate that seems to happen and go away really quickly at this moment in time. Hopefully something changes and people do pay more attention to the situation on the ground. But I think it's a short-term strategy at the moment that garners kind of an increase in discussion on the situation, and then it kind of goes away. But that could change. I don't know. I think in terms of the Israeli government response, it was again what you would expect. Israel has a very negative view of human rights organizations. It has a very negative view of the UN, but kind of in a way that it gets dismissed. Anything international, like Israelis don't know the difference. Obviously, like the average Israeli won't be able to tell the difference between Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, and this, like, they just dismiss that community kind of widely. And so I think that's why the debate is more heated in the international community. It was generally kind of condemned by Israeli politicians, including Yair Lapid, the foreign minister and meant to be upcoming prime minister. He did, prior to the report, actually express concern in saying, this is a challenge that we're going to face, is that Israel is being labeled as an apartheid state more and more. The unfortunate thing with the Israeli politicians, they're engaging in it from what's called a Hasbara perspective, as in public affairs, public communications perspective. And that's the strategy they're focusing on. How do we tell our side of the story better? As opposed to, we have a human rights crisis that only we have the power to really resolve, and we need to make things better. They're not really focusing on the human rights issues, but rather on the very external of how do we improve our image on a global level.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I mean, just a quote from Yair Lapid, as you said, is actually generally seen as a centrist, perhaps self-describes as a centrist, and also is for instance on Ukrainian refugees now has spoken for extending a welcoming hand to non-Jews who would come from Ukraine, but he labeled the Amnesty International report as having conclusions that are false, biased, and anti-Semitic. And as you said, that's a distinction. The board of deputies hasn't gone down the rabbit hole of calling it anti-Semitism, but Lapid did. So I think the final question I want to put to you, and then I'll have to leave it to Anne-Marie to lead whatever I think questions are already mounting in the chat. I can already see quite a few. Is actually about the way forward, in the sense of utilizing not just the Amnesty International report, but perhaps the increased attention to suffering that even Ukraine's kind of invasion may bring, right? So the notion that occupation is wrong, the notion that human rights abuses, that international humanitarian law has to be adhered to, that accountability matters in institutions like the ICC. What role do you see for, as you were, the British political system in particular, in trying to harness, as you were, these opportunities to increase pressure on Israel?
I think the unfortunate thing is within the current British government, we're going kind of the opposite way. And rather of trying to put pressure on Israel, we're trying to reduce ways in which Palestinians can express themselves. So obviously you'll have seen that an amendment passed in the parliament just a few weeks ago around a pensions bill, but basically preventing local councils from passing BDS with regards to local pension investments. That's going to go further. There's another BDS law coming up that no one has seen, but is meant to come up, that's going to prevent BDS in local authorities. There has been comments from senior British government officials around the phrase "from the river to the sea" and how it needs to be banned. And I think it's getting worse. We're not seriously engaging with Palestinian narratives, and not only that, now we're trying to silence them. And that's not to say, obviously, we're not an organization that endorses the BDS movement, but to try and silence any form of non-violent protest and to try and prevent Palestinians from expressing their experiences is really dangerous. I think there's a lot that the British government can do, and much of it is to do with actually listening to their own policies. So the British government already calls settlements illegal and condemns settlement expansion, but doesn't seem to really want to put any pressure on the Israeli government to stop settlement expansion. And also, if you look at kind of the British consulate in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, the British government's representative is kind of standing saying, you know, these evictions in Sheikh Jarrah are awful and we need to do something about it. And we haven't seen a stronger response from the British government. So I think a lot of it's to do with listening to our own officials on the ground, such as the British consul, and also applying our own policies, especially around settlements. And I think the downfall that this new government being more liberal and more approachable has made everyone more comfortable with engaging in Israel. And that's fine, but that means that we should be more comfortable in pressuring Israel as well. I think because people see Lapid and Bennett as better faith actors than they did Bibi, they feel more comfortable in kind of endorsing Israel, which is fine, but you also then need to use that friendship to criticize and to pressure. And we don't seem to be doing that at the moment, which I think is unfortunate.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right. I'll just end by saying that one, of course, way that specifically within the Lib Dems one can harness the report is in fact, when it comes to the question of sanctions that you mentioned earlier, or more specifically boycott. Actually, the Amnesty International report position is exactly the Lib Dem position, in the sense that the Amnesty International report calls for having essentially the recommendation is to institute and enforce a ban on products from Israeli settlements in your market, and to regulate companies domiciled in your jurisdiction, to prohibit companies' operation in settlements and trading in settlement goods. And that's precisely the policy the Liberal Democrats adopted in September. So not a full-fledged BDS, so not a BDS of Israel, but a distinction between the West Bank and Israel, and a boycott on settlement. That's of course not to the UK government policy, but it is this party's policy, and there is scope for using that in Parliament. I think again in the light of recent events as well. So I think with that, I'll thank you very much for your engagement. I really enjoyed this conversation. I wish I didn't have to leave, but I do have to kind of virtually hop over to the other room. So Anne-Marie, can I perhaps ask you to? Oh, there you go. To rejoin us, and I shall leave you there. And as I said, thanks everyone for attending as well.
Oh. I was in 2022 and the same for me. I was going to thank Ruvi, but my unmuting was not going quickly enough. I'll thank him later. So thank you, Danielle. I think from some of the comments in the chat, it's quite clear that you've impressed everybody with your responses. And it'd be interesting to see what questions come up now. So thank you very much. John, do you want to join us and ask your question to Danielle, please? John Kelly.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Actually, I had two, but the second one I asked is perhaps the one that most follows from the recent discussion about Yair Lapid, and it basically, last year, Liberal International admitted Yesh Atid as an observer member, a kind of probationary status. And I find this rather embarrassing because while Lapid seems a much nicer guy than Netanyahu and his party more decent than they could, Danielle, you seem to agree that things are getting worse under the current coalition. What would get Lapid to behave more like a liberal?
So I wouldn't say things are getting worse. I just don't think they're quite getting better yet. First of all, keeping in mind that Lapid is not currently prime minister, but I think truly what would make him act like more like a liberal is more international pressure, is for his partners. I don't think we should boycott speaking to him. On the contrary, I think that when we do speak to him, we make it very clear that settlement expansion in particular, and that's where I think the international community is able to influence the most when it comes to settlement expansion and eviction of Palestinians. And we've already seen international pressure working. We've seen several settlements being stopped from being built. We have seen family evictions being stopped in Sheikh Jarrah. Obviously, it's very difficult to measure the pressure of international involvement, but we kind of have a general view that when the Americans step in and put pressure, things do stop. And I think that's really, really important. And I think that I do think the Liberal Democrat motion on banning settlement products was very good. I thought Layla Moran's article, especially in the Jewish Chronicle, was very good because it's very difficult to fault what she wrote. She's clearly not someone who's anti-Israel. The motion was clearly not anti-Israel. And I do think when it comes to Yair Lapid and his wider party, I still say, like, there are people you can speak to, and I do think they are willing to have a fairly sensible conversation. Lapid has already made some really decent comments, making it clear that we need to shift from previous Netanyahu policy where everything that was critical of Israel was labeled as anti-Semitism. And I think when we see those comments being made by people like Lapid, we should absolutely applaud them and endorse them and make it clear that that's where we stand. But yeah, I think if he's part of the Lib Dems, or what, I can't remember the term that you used, but use that friendship to put pressure on.
Did you have another question, John, while you're there?
Yeah, thank you. It's Liberal International, which is a group of about 100 Liberal Democrat or Liberal parties that broadly subscribe to Lib Dem values around the world. We founded it actually about 100 years ago, I think. And it includes, interestingly, the party of Vladimir Zelensky, and it's representative of his party that I think Ruvi has gone off to engage with, actually. So my other question was that you made the interesting point that Israelis don't routinely read about the hardships of Palestinians, and so I'm not terribly aware of it. But what about the newspaper Haaretz, which I have to say I do read regularly and think very highly of, and are there no other media that both Jewish and Arab Israelis both see or read?
Yes, so I think Haaretz is obviously really good. Haaretz in English and Haaretz in Hebrew are slightly different. So I think be aware of that as well. The English version is more to the left and does speak to an international audience, and I just do think be aware of that. But the Haaretz is a great newspaper, and it does make people aware of occupation, but it's labeled as a left-wing newspaper, and so most of the people who read it are already left-wing, are already sympathetic to Palestinians. And so the fact that, yes, that is a paper that talks about occupation, it talks about, it does engage with breaking the silence and Peace Now, etc. really well, but it, as with everything in media, it kind of preaches to the converted. The Israeli news channel Kan, which is one of the three biggest news channels in Israel, Channel 11, is far more liberal. It actually isn't just in terms of the news that it has, but also in terms of the programming that it has. So it features more issues on Palestinians, on like trans issues. Like, it's a generally more liberal media, and I think actually that's good. So like the programming includes non-Israelis and Palestinians rather than just the news. I think what's interesting though is also it's up to our leaders, as in Israeli leaders, because when they speak of these issues, then it's featured on the news. And if they don't, then it doesn't make headlines. And I think it is interesting that, for example, the citizenship law has been quite an interesting test, because that's twice it's been voted on in the past 6 months. It's a law that's been renewed every year in Israel, and no one's taken any interest in it. And the fact that this government has a left-wing side and an Arab party that won't vote for it has made it a headline. And that's the first time I've seen major public debate on this law. And I think that's really interesting as an example. And I think more widely, you know, that if our Israeli leaders do make more noise over these issues, then it will make headlines, and then people hear about it in mainstream news. I think also huge credit to Israeli human rights organizations for really pushing for these discussions. And I think if you look at organizations like Omdim Beyachad, Standing Together, who during the May conflict, war, whatever you want to call it, went out and protested with like Jews and non-Jews protesting together for peace and against violence, etc. And I think, again, they brought it to the mainstream awareness of Israelis, these issues and partnership and so on.
Thank you. Andy, do you want to come on, Andy Dare, to ask your questions? I've got some questions as well, but I'll store it up for the end.
I was saying the same thing. Sorry, I know that there have been some other questions from other members of the audience since I put my question in, but I just sort of if you can just give a brief answer to this, Danielle. We're British Liberal Democrats, and although we did achieve something in our conference last year when we voted to ban trade with the settlements, I think a lot of us get involved in focusing on making lots of criticisms of Israel and calling out, publicizing what's going on with the settlers and things that we disapprove of, which personally I think has very little effect in Israel other than to cause a very defensive attitude, which is what you were describing with the Amnesty report. People just get defensive about it and look for reasons to avoid facing the truth. And that I've just wondered whether there are other things that we could be doing which would reach the Israeli people, not necessarily so much the government, but the Israeli people, so that they would then be looking for change. Because I feel that a lot of us, I think, in our movement, feel that it's not just the Palestinians who are being abused by the current system, but Israelis are sort of locked into this militaristic attitude towards their neighbors, and everybody needs to be saved really from this cycle of violence or hatred and distrust. I just wonder if you can think of something quickly so that we can there's a couple of other people, Simon Banks and Jonathan Brown. I'm doing I know what you're going to tell me, Anne-Marie. Just very quickly, what we could be doing more. I'll mute.
Engage with Israelis. Speak to as many Israelis as you possibly can. Speak to Israeli human rights organizations. Speak to Israeli politicians. Give them a platform. Engage with them. Challenge them. Make it clear make your stance clear. You don't hate Israel. You have an issue with settlements. You are concerned by Sheikh Jarrah. But engage with Israelis and Israeli human rights organizations.
Perfect. Could I have Simon Banks, please, next then? I'll come back to you, Jonathan, as well. And we've got Leon as well, Davine. So Simon Banks, please. I'm not sure if Simon can join or not. Should I ask the question for him and if he joins? So what about the attitudes of Jewish communities in other countries, France, Germany, South Africa, Australia and USA, is the question.
I truly am not a member of those communities and can't speak for them. The one I'll say that probably is the biggest player is the American community that I know a little bit more about. So the American community is more progressive. We know that American Jews are Democrats and are more supportive of left-wing liberal views. The liberal community is far larger there, and they probably have a bigger impact in terms of lobbying because they're a bigger community. But I mean, I just don't know enough about other communities to comment on them.
That's a good answer. Thank you. Leon, would you like to come on and ask your question? Leon Devine? Just need to unmute.
Yeah. Okay. Danielle. As a fellow Israeli living here in the UK, I want to know what we can do to help the peacemakers on both sides, and there are plenty, and I work with some of them. What can we do to help build that consensus that we need in both states to actually achieve any peace settlement? Because unless the consensus is there, unless the people support it, whatever agreement we come to, it just won't hold.
So I'm going to get a bit repetitive with my answers. Engage with Israelis and Palestinians as much as you possibly can. I think we do tend to get caught up in our own debates too much, and I think that was really clear with some of the sometimes in the left. It's a lot of people in the UK expressing opinions about something that they're not close to, and I think as much as possible strengthening the human rights community and the community of people who do try and create kind of a mutual understanding, shared language, etc. Kind of try and find out which organizations suit your interest, and Yachad can help with that, because I spend time in Tel Aviv and we work with a lot of organizations, but as much as you possibly can, uplift those voices. And that includes, there are Palestinian organizations that are fighting for democracy within Palestine and fighting against corruption in the West Bank. And I just think people aren't aware enough about what the reality is. They're not aware enough about what the perspectives are and what the lived experiences are. And so much of the commentary is kind of noise around that. And I really just think we just have to uplift authentic voices on the ground as much as possible, and just give them a platform and listen to them. And that includes like sharing their reports online and sharing the information in the articles that they share, and pushing for what they think is needed, and giving them, if you can, give them a platform in the British Parliament. There's so many great speakers and so many great members of the Israeli Knesset who really need to be heard and listened to. And so if you're, whether it's a cross-party opportunity or whatever it might be, pass the mic is what I would say.
Yeah. Trying to do that in my own small way as best I can.
Thank you. Jonathan Brown, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Danielle. Thank you. It's been really fascinating so far. My question was going back to the debate about Israeli public opinion in relation to the Ukraine war. I know there's a large sort of Russian-Israeli community, and I'd just be interested to know whether, if you know, whether the views within that sort of sub-community are sort of a different from more mainstream Israeli society, and if so, if they are the same or similar to the rest of Israeli society, does that perhaps open up any new possibilities, do you think? Because again, in my experience, it seems like the Russian Israelis tend to be characterized as voting for sort of quite right-wing anti-peace parties, although not necessarily for reasons of racism per se. Thanks.
I'm conscious of time, but the Russian Israeli community is actually more of an ex-USSR Israeli community, and so they're not just people who came from what we now call Russia. There are a lot of people from Ukraine and other countries, and I've been asked to make that distinction by a lot of former Soviet Union Jews, and so I think that's quite important. And also keeping in mind that a lot of those people left Russia because for like persecution reasons rather than so I think that needs to be kept in mind in that community. I haven't seen kind of polling on ex-USSR Israelis and how they feel. From what I've seen in protest, it does seem like there's solidarity amongst that community in general, but I couldn't tell you the numbers. I think it's just a comment on the fact that they vote for more right-wing parties. So Israelis from some former Soviet Union tend to not be religious, and as in because obviously they came from a regime where their Judaism was kind of not allowed, and so a lot of them don't identify with religious law and are very frustrated by religious law in Israel, and so that the party that they naturally are more likely to vote for is a party called Israel Beitenu, which means Israel our home, led by Avigdor Lieberman. He is more right-wing, especially when it comes to Palestinian issues, but that voting record is much more to do with the tension between former USSR Jews and religious Jews. So even like the issue around kosher, a lot of non-kosher food in Israel that you'll get is in Soviet Union Israeli stores. So that's kind of the tension that leads them to vote in that way, rather than the Palestinian issue.
Thank you. Yes, that's what I was getting at. I just wondered whether if there was anything sort of specific to say about that sub-community having their attitude to seeing what's happening in Ukraine changing their particular views within Israel. But thank you.
Yeah, we do have about 9 minutes left, Danielle, and I can't see any more questions in the Q&A, but please put some in if you have time. I do actually have one myself, which is you mentioned a blind spot when it comes to human rights and Palestinian or with Palestinian issues and human rights within Israeli society, I think in particular. And I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on that and why that would be, because I think it's an important thing to understand that I think from conversations we had before, that it's not that Israelis don't see themselves as not caring about human rights. We've lost her for a second. There she is.
Sorry, I have to plug in my computer, but I can still hear you.
So I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on that blind spot on Palestinian issues when it comes to human rights that perhaps some in Israeli society have.
Yeah, I mean, I really do think it's to do with the fact that Israelis just don't see occupation. It's not the things that we might see on Twitter or talk about in Parliament, and the reality of occupation is generally not on Israeli news. It's if you live in Israel, you don't see it and you don't hear about it. I went to a secular Israeli school in a fairly liberal area in central Israel, and I didn't know Palestinians, and I didn't see Palestinians, and I didn't see occupation. And that's not because like my parents weren't particularly, right wing, and they weren't anti-Palestinian. It's just not something that was ever talked about. And I think that's a really common experience. And then, as we mentioned, a lot of Israelis then only see Palestinians in the military context and in the context of occupation, where they, as 18-year-old soldiers, and I'm not defending soldiers in that sense, but as an 18-year-old who's just been drafted into the army, you are afraid and you are scared, and you're put in these situations where you have an enemy, and that's your only experience of Palestinians. Of course, you're not going to be sympathetic to Palestinian people. Arabic is taught in elementary schools, although not all, but only for 2 years. So people also don't speak Arabic, so it sounds like a really foreign language to them. And yeah, it's just not something that's discussed. And when it is discussed and you hear about Palestinians, it's within the context of war. And I think that's really problematic. But I also think, and I would say, have some sympathy for the average Israeli, because very few Israelis have not grown up with some form of trauma, be it from war, be it from, the Intifada. Most Israelis have experienced trauma that most Westerners haven't experienced. And so that does shape their view of Palestinians. So I was in Israel in May, and obviously there were rockets being fired in from Gaza. I'm a very left-wing Israeli, and so I don't represent the average view in any way, shape, or form. But if you're a kid and that's your experience, and you know that those people over there over the border are making you run to a bomb shelter at 2 a.m., and that's your only experience of Palestinians, then you're not going to see them in a human way. You're going to see them as an enemy beyond a border. And yeah, that's kind of the unfortunate reality. And I think similarly for Palestinians, their main experience of Israelis is the people at checkpoints who stop them from going in and out, or the soldiers that come and see their homes at whatever time of night and question them. So everyone has this collective trauma, but that's never shared, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. And I think it leads on quite nicely. I'm going to pinch John Kelly's question, actually, given the time constraint. So John actually puts in the Q&A, our party leadership and the Labour parties seem to spend a lot of time worrying about the attitude of the Board of Deputies in the Jewish Chronicle. But it seems to me that people they should listen more to in the Jewish community are liberal organisations like yours. Do you find that our leadership shows much interest in what you think? So the leadership of the Lib Dems.
So Yachad as an organization has a really great relationship with the Liberal Democrats, and we're very grateful for that. I think that obviously our views are not of the majority of the community, in that we speak about occupation very frequently and we engage in a more left-wing narrative on Palestinian issues, but we're also not complete outliers. I mean, at the end of the day, most British Jews do support two-state solution, which means ending occupation. Most British Jews are opposed to BDS, but they do believe in peace. And I think that is that's a very high level, but ultimately our views are not that different. It's just that we speak about the issue more differently and we put more of a light on those issues. But also a lot of the people that we work with are young people and students, and who are the next generation of leaders for our community. And I think they often get dismissed. And that's wrong, because they're people who are really trying to educate themselves on this issue, and they don't want to become anti-Zionist or, completely reject the community. On the contrary, they want to engage in a positive way. And I think that their voices should be uplifted as much as possible. But I would say, don't completely dismiss engagement with the board or organizations just because I disagree with their views. Ultimately, they should be listened to and engaged with in as much of a positive way as possible. But it is really important to engage with liberal, progressive Jewish voices who work with Israelis and Palestinians on the ground, and who are trying to challenge the narrative in the British community. And I think quite successfully. That's I'm taking credit for Yachad, but I think as much as possible, if you can engage more, and this is great, having this platform and being able to have this discussion is really helpful for us.
Thank you. I think that's absolutely engaging is absolutely key. And I am so grateful for this conversation we've had with you today, and also to Ruvi, who hopefully when he watches the recording will see that I'm thanking him as well. So really, it's been really interesting, and I think you've spoken really well and got us all thinking. So thank you ever so much, and I'm very grateful. And I don't know if John would like to come back in on his final question or not, to finish off in the 2 minutes that are left, or 3 minutes that are left. And I also want to thank obviously the audience, because I think we at the moment have 24 people watching, but there was up to 30 at one point. So I'd like to thank them as well. Right, I think it's all very good, and I think it's a good place actually to end. I haven't seen, unless there's something in the chat that I've missed, because there's a Q&A in the chat as well. I think that's probably quite a good place to end the Fringe meeting, and I'd really like to thank you again, Danielle. That's great.
Thank you so much for having me.
And fascinating discussion. You're getting claps and everything.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.